Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good Thursday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 14th of August. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather conditions and forecasts by going to weather.gov/Alaska or arh.noaa.gov. Give us a call on the weather info line at 800-472-0391. Find each Weather Service office on Twitter, on Facebook, and on YouTube. And you can get the complete Alaska Weather Show after this one in the evening hours by going to our broadcast partner here at alaskapublic.org, or simply go to YouTube and at the top search bar type in AKWX-TV, and that's where you'll find the broadcasts there and many more back through history if you really want to watch them all. The other thing you can do in the afternoon, of course, is get the daily afternoon map briefing that you'll find on our weather.gov page. You can get that. It's about 2.5 minutes long there, so it works really well on your cell phone. If you're out in the bush, that's probably going to be a lot better friend than what you'll see on YouTube for the full half-hour content. The other thing we just posted today is some Alaska Weather Facts interviews with Eric Stevens from GINA up in Fairbanks there. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about how some of the satellites work and some of the new tools that they're offering there, you can watch any of those videos anytime you like. Today's hazardous weather includes only a flood advisory for the Kenai Peninsula on the western side there. This is still focused on the Kenai River and Kenai Lakes area thanks to recent runoff. That region along the Kenai River and the Kenai Lake remains high, and while that has been in around moderate flood stage at times, I believe it looks like that flood advisory will continue until Monday about 10 o'clock or so. So kind of long range plan if you're going out fishing perhaps over the weekend along the Kenai River, Kenai Lake, or the Tustamina Lake for that matter too. Keep in mind, river levels could still be coming up at times, especially with more rain through that period. And always be careful around flooding conditions there and never drive through flooded roadways. If you live along that area, you might want to keep a close watch on the situation and be prepared to move to higher ground if the flooding worsens in your area. Here's a look at some of the headlines we're talking about today for Alaska weather. Unsettled weather continues over the Aleutians and the Gulf of Alaska with a large trough of low pressure across the Gulf of Alaska extending well into the Arctic. Gales are expected for some in the Chain and the northern Gulf tonight and into tomorrow. And we're still watching that high runoff for the Kenai River, the flood advisory again until about 10:15 on Monday morning. As we look at the infrared satellite picture, this is something that is sensing the temperature of the air and determining that this is probably cloud cover, and that paints the picture for us there. You'll see a steady stream of warmer, wetter air moving toward the northern Gulf, and where that hits the really high peaks there and the land juts up out of the ocean instantly, right there around the Wrangell-St. Elias region and Yakutat. Well, that's where we saw about 2.5 inches of rain just today alone around Yakutat. So some very wet air and focused right there on one of the wettest places on the planet. Now across the Alaska Range in southwestern Alaska, it did rain today. Prince William Sound by and large saw about a ½ inch of rain depending on exactly which side of the sound you were. Cordova, one of the wetter places today. Juneau also picked up about a ½ inch. Seward saw about 1/3 of an inch of rain. Valdez about 4/10 or so. So pretty soggy day if you're in Prince William Sound or the north and northeastern Gulf of Alaska. Clouds are also moving northward toward the Brooks Range and westward. Saw a couple lightning strikes today out across the southern Brooks Range slopes, and we have a new storm on the chart there across the central Aleutians. That's the one that's producing the gales for the central Chain and north and south. Expect that to continue as we go through the next 24 hours. This is the visible satellite picture, a little bit more of a real snapshot. If you took your own camera up into space and snapped a picture, that's probably what you'd see across the region. You'll see a little bit of cloud cover here across the areas just north of the Yukon Valley into the Seward Peninsula, and then plenty of dry air across Bristol Bay. A lot of low, smooth clouds once again. That's fog and stratus across the Bering, of course, and then the ragged western side of that trough of low pressure crossing the eastern Gulf. This is our moisture channel. It looks a lot smaller with the visible satellite picture than that broad sweeping view of the warm, wet air that we saw in the infrared. As that moves northward there, we still see a wealth of cloud cover across south central. Some breaks in the clouds, though, across southern parts of southeast, so a little bit of a break for you there. And when you look at the interior, well, no wonder, after a little bit of sunshine early today and the cooler morning air left, well, we saw temperatures soaring up to about 78 degrees in Fairbanks this afternoon. So another mild day for you after a string of really cool weather for a large part of the summer. Today's weather shows low pressure across the northern Gulf. Again, that frontal boundary working northward, responsible for a dousing of rain around Yakutat and northern parts of southeast. This front really wants to fall apart. It's running into a ridge of high pressure that's just chewing up the leading edge of that, squeezing that moisture down to next to nothing. It's still being wrung out, of course, but this front is on its way out of town and slowly it's trying to hold on as hard as it can, but it really wants to go away. Low pressure across the central chain at 992 millibars then will take the rains and probably the rain into northern sections of the Gulf as we head into the next 24 hours. Several other circulations can be found on the satellite image and on the pressure pattern here, but the main player is the one in the Gulf and, of course, the one across the central chain. We've got a weaker frontal boundary across the central and eastern parts of the Brooks Range and just north of the Yukon Valley. As we go into tonight, that'll probably shift just a little bit north. It's just kind of wobbling around from time to time without a whole lot of focus. There is cooler air up here. It's blowing pretty hard from east to west, and we have that warmer, wetter air lifting northward. So you could say there's a boundary here, and again, it's going to wobble around a little bit. Here's that front. Yes, when we start to see the breaks in the front, that means it's trying to die, and it's trying to move into this ridge. It's not going to make it by the time it gets to extreme southeastern parts of southern Alaska or the Pacific Northwest for that matter, especially since a lot of the upper level energy is really being focused now on that wave of low pressure across the central and eastern chain. By tonight, it's 985 millibars. The winds on the back side of this really starting to pick up, so that's where our gales are coming from tonight and into tomorrow. Troughs of low pressure extend into the Yukon Valley and across Bristol Bay and Kodiak Island. That's going to keep that rain going, and the heaviest of which will still be around Prince William Sound and northern parts of southeast and the northeastern Gulf. Elsewhere, passing light rain, maybe even just showery in nature. Beyond that, it looks like more of a wind issue in the west and a little bit more of a rain issue for the eastern Gulf. By Friday, our low pressure system is still hanging out around 986 millibars. Not a really big change from what we see overnight. We start to see a tighter pressure gradient here south of Kodiak Island. That's probably going to pick up that moisture feed once again and refocus that moisture channel right into south central Alaska and the north and western Gulf. Eventually, by the end of the weekend, that channel is going to shift a little bit more to the north and east. Here's our front, still holding on, still being a focus for some light rainfall across southeast, but it's dying. It's almost gone. Our ridge of high pressure still intact there. A trough of low pressure across the northern and eastern sections of the Yukon Valley. Out to the west, also a disturbance right there along the western coast for Kotzebue Sound and Norton Sound. This circulation not terribly strong at 998 millibars, but it's enough to keep the southerly flow going across the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta and keep lift in the atmosphere present. That means showers and rain still possible. And it looks like south central and southwestern Alaska will get a taste of the wind as we get into Saturday once again with the frontal boundary working north. That's going to squeeze that air through some of that tighter terrain, and just like we were seeing today around Turnagain Arm and the upper hillside and some areas in the Portage Valley, gusts could reach into the 40-mile-an-hour range at least for a little while, if not for a good part of the day. On top of that, coastal communities will be dealing with another opportunity for some focused and heavy rainfall. Low pressure across Bristol Bay is weakening, so those numbers are coming up, 994 millibars there. Pressure is still a little bit tight across Kodiak Island. Expect some winds there and through Shelikof Strait. We see our trough of low pressure up through Kotzebue Sound. Showers will likely be found across a good part of the Brooks Range, and maybe some of that will creep into the Arctic coast east of the Barrow out toward Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse and Kaktovik. And then out to the west, we start to see more of a northerly or drier flow from St. Matthew through the Pribilofs. Probably looking at a good chance for fog, as you would expect, but the opportunity for higher winds and precipitation should be diminishing. Temperatures today across southeast, well, if you were in the sunshine, you popped into the 70s. Many areas there from Ketchikan out toward Hyder saw a taste of that, at least for a little while today. A little more cloud cover across the coastal areas, and then in the north, a much better opportunity for temps in the 50s thanks to rainfall earlier. Yakutat squeezed out 58 degrees along with that 2.5 inches of rain today. 50s and 60s for Prince William Sound, 62 in Kenai, 60 in Homer, 57 for Seward, 62 in Anchorage. Talkeetna, a milder upper 50s today, a little bit cooler than what you've been dealing with for a good part of the summer. 66 in Healy, 70 at Fort Greeley, and 74 around Fairbanks, with Tanana showing 72. 71 in Eagle this afternoon, 66 in Fort Yukon. Around Anaktuvuk Pass, a mild 61 degrees. Once you get over the hill, temperatures cooled off quickly into the 30s and 40s. Barrow was 37. Just east of the Alcan, 46 degrees along the coast there. Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse, much colder and windier, 39. 53 around Wainwright, with the Kotzebue Sound temperatures pretty much in the 50s and 60s. In fact, Shishmaref was one of the cooler spots today at 54. Tin City showing 49, 48 around Savunga. A good part of Norton Sound in the lower 60s today. Once you got inland, temperatures shot up even more. 69 in Galena. Ruby was in the lower 70s. Around Grayling, 68. Bethel, 64. Nunivak Island, lower 60s there. Around Bristol Bay, temperatures were fairly close to 60 degrees, even inland toward Lake Iliamna. In fact, it was a little bit cooler there. 58 around Cape Newenham. Lower 60s around Sand Point, all the way up toward Port Highland and Pilot Point. 56 around Cold Bay and False Pass. Unalaska Dutch Harbor in the mid-50s. The Pribilofs, well, if you were in St. Paul, it was a pretty mild day at 58. A little bit cooler in St. George, but still not too bad considering the time of year. And lower 50s for the Central Chain, and 52 out in Atka. Or Attu. There you go. I got to get my A name right. Your low temperatures tonight around the Yukon Valley, likely in the lower to mid 50s, so pretty mild stuff for some of the lower terrain there, all the way into Fort Yukon at 55. Southeast, looking at temperatures also in the mid 50s, a little bit further south toward Ketchikan and Annette. Temps could be in the upper 50s. South Central, lower to mid 50s, with Kodiak at 51, Bristol Bay near 50 degrees. The Alaska Peninsula also lower 50s. The Pribilofs lower 50s. The Central and Western Chain, the lower 50s. You catching a pattern here? The Northern Sound, lower 50s. Nome, 54, and that should just about do the trick. Let's take a look around the high temperatures tomorrow. The Arctic coast, probably lower 40s. Barrow, 41. 62 in Nome. Southwest, looking at temps in the mid-60s. Fairbanks, 66. South Central, lower 60s. Prince William Sound will still be cool in the upper 50s thanks to rain and cloud cover. Southeast, lower 60s. Yakutat, a little bit cooler than that. Upper 50s to lower 60s for the Alaska Peninsula, and mid-50s for the Central and Western Chain. Now, flying weather tomorrow. IFR is expected once again across the Arctic coast. Some improvements there west of Barrow toward Wainwright into the Kotzebue Sound region and down the west coast. MVFR through a good part of the Bristol Bay region. The Alaska Peninsula will be hit and miss MVFR, and IFR conditions through Prince William Sound toward Yakutat, and then that improves right along that frontal boundary as it heads into southeast. Remember, that front is trying to fall apart. Your flying weather pass conditions in Anaktuvuk Pass should head over toward MVFR. We're going to watch for some convection during the day there and in Adigan Pass tomorrow. So ceilings and visibility probably coming down with the opportunity for thunderstorms in the afternoon. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass see improvements during the daytime, probably heading into MVFR by mid to late day, maybe better than that if we're lucky. Rainy Pass, MVFR conditions for your daytime tomorrow. Windy Pass likely seeing a start out at VFR conditions, so get started early, but heading over to MVFR during the daytime hours. As we go around the Alaska Range a little bit more, Isabel Pass expected to see MVFR conditions by the end of the day. Mentasta Pass looks pretty good for visibility tomorrow. Tanita Pass, MVFR conditions through a good part of Friday, and Portage Pass, the wind should subside somewhat, but expect IFR conditions to return in the eastern side. MVFR could be seen all the way into Portage Pass itself and through a good part of Turtlingate Arm. So keep watch on that for some improvement possibilities, but doesn't look too good. Chilkoot and White Pass also expected to see MVFR conditions by the end of the day. Now, freezing levels show that cold air is really taking charge of the Bering and the western Gulf of Alaska. Those levels are at or below 8,000 feet for the west coast, southwest especially, and a good part of the chain. You can see the warm air really isn't giving it up for southeastern Alaska. It's holding tight and trying to regain the interior and the North Slope. Probably won't happen in any great fashion. Right now, cold air winning under that trough of low pressure in the upper atmosphere. Icing potential generally above 10,000 feet for all areas. Didn't really see any major focus for it to go a whole lot lower. We do have mild air still in place across a good part of Alaska. Even though those numbers are dropping at the freezing level map there's still the moisture and the ability for that to freeze. You got to climb high up there. That being said, there were an awful lot of icing reports today. Some of those reaching mixed, moderate across south central Alaska in places like Kenai, places like the Alaska Peninsula, all around that area of low pressure that's working through the Gulf. So don't be surprised if you run into some isolated moderate, and that's what this color means, light to isolated moderate, and in some cases it may be mixed as it has been today. And again, you'll have to climb pretty high up there across the North Slope and the Brooks Range to run into that light to isolated moderate area. We've also drawn in the possibility of thunderstorms tomorrow. The jet stream shows a trough of low pressure across the Gulf. That is really, across the Bering. That really hasn't changed a whole lot in the last couple days. We've got our main core of the jet stream zipping into the Gulf of Alaska, and that is going to reinforce this digging pattern here that we see across the Bering. A ridge of high pressure to the west is trying to force our trough to stay across Alaska. We also have a storm system here across the Pacific Northwest. So right now the pattern is not changing a whole lot. At 9,000 feet, our trough is represented here by low pressure close to Unalaska and Dutch Harbor with northwesterly winds behind it at 15 to 30 knots. More of a south and southwesterly flow diverging here across the Gulf of Alaska. That helps to add a little more lift at the surface and get those clouds turning into rain clouds. Southwestern Alaska, southeast, looking at southwesterly winds, 10 to about 30 knots or so, and more of a light southerly flow across the interior, perhaps around 15 to 20 knots. At 3,000 feet, the eastern Aleutian chain seeing winds between 25 and 35 knots. On the back side, though, those winds pick up to 40 knots coming through Adak and Atka, and with that, again, gales at the surface are expected. Southerly flow across the Gulf, keeping the rain machine on. Very light winds around the western side of the ridge coming into the Dixon entrance. Only 5 knots there. That's not too bad. Stronger winds coming up the western Alaska range, 40 knots, and then just throwing on the brakes once they get down in altitude a little bit and over the hill. Only 5 knots there for the interior, with a stronger northeasterly flow west of the Bering Strait and south and easterly winds crossing over the Beaufort Seacoast around 20 to 25 knots. Turbulence then should be expected below 6,000 feet along the Arctic coast. Most of that will be right on the coast and north or offshore. Most of the coastal plain will see some gusts, but probably not that light to isolated moderate turbulence. Scattered showers and storms there along the Yukon and points north, and below 6,000 feet we should expect some light to isolated moderate turbulence for parts of the Alaska Peninsula and into the North Pacific. That's a look at your aviation forecast. I'll be back in just a few minutes with an ice edge update and of course your marine weather. Stay tuned.
Pairs of planets. Hey there, stargazers. I'm Dean Regas, astronomer for the Cincinnati Observatory. Have you ever seen or even heard of the Beehive Cluster?
And I'm James Albury, director of the Kika Silva Pla Planetarium in Gainesville, Florida. Next week, the 2 brightest planets, Jupiter and Venus, will have an early morning super scoochie right next to the Beehive.
And Mars and Saturn will pass each other in the evening twilight. Let's show you. We have our skies set up facing southwest after sunset next week on the 18th. And as it gets darker, a pair of bright lights will be the first things you see over here. The upper one is the ring planet Saturn, and about 5 degrees down and to the right is the reddish-orange planet Mars. They'll look about the same brightness, but slightly different colors.
Not long ago, we showed you how to use your pinky finger to measure the size of the moon. Remember? The moon is always smaller than your pinky finger. Well, now we want you to use your whole fist and hold it over Saturn and Mars. What do you see?
Your fist will completely cover both of them with plenty left over. Saturn and Mars are about 5 degrees apart, while your fist covers about twice that much, or 10 degrees of the sky.
Get out after sunset each night for the next few weeks and watch this pair of peripatetic planets. For the first few nights, they'll actually get closer each night, but after a week or so, they'll separate again and show you why they're called planets. They're the wanderers of the sky.
To the left of Mars and Saturn are the stars of Scorpius the Scorpion. 3 along here form the head, and long curving line of stars down here form the body. The bright red star Antares marks his heart. What about his claws, you may be asking? Well, Saturn lies right between them. These claw stars have some of James's favorite names to pronounce, so I'll defer to him to tell you all about them.
The upper claw is Zubin Eshemali, which actually means northern claw, and the lower one is Zubin el-Janubi, the southern claw. Zubin Eshemali puts out 270 times as much light as our sun, while Zubin el-Janubi, I just love the sound of that, is closer to us but not as powerful.
So on August 18th, just after it gets dark, look southwest for Saturn and Mars.
With Scorpius off to the left.
Antares, the bright red heart.
And the claw stars Zubin Eshemali and Zubin el-Janubi.
What about this beehive we mentioned earlier?
Let's take a look at Dean's favorite time, the early morning.
No!
Here we are facing east well before sunrise. And depending upon exactly how early you get up, what you see may vary. Winter's Orion is in the southeastern sky, and Castor and Pollux are off to his left. But the really big thing we dragged you out of bed to see is this bright pair of stars below Castor and Pollux.
They rise about an hour and a half before sunrise, but once they're up high enough to be seen, they're much brighter than anything else out there. The left one, Venus, is about 7 times brighter than Jupiter, the other one. Yep, here are 2 more planets wandering across the sky.
And the really neat thing about this is they are insanely close together, about 1/4 of a degree apart. A super scoochie if there ever was one. Be sure you don't miss this.
If you go out the next day, Venus will have moved almost a degree farther away from Jupiter. Next summer, at the end of June, Venus and Jupiter will get close again, but they'll be twice as far apart as they'll be next week. So now is the time.
And I'm sure you've been wondering about that beehive we mentioned earlier. Well, if you look at Jupiter and Venus with a pair of binoculars, you'll see a swarm of stars off to the left of the planets.
This beehive is a cluster of stars that lies about 600 light years away. If you have clear skies and good eyes, this cluster is easy to see, but most of us don't live under good skies. So take this opportunity to find the beehive.
So it's Saturn and Mars in the evening in the west.
And Jupiter, Venus, and the beehive in the morning in the east.
Keep looking up.
Our ice experts are still saying there is some rotting ice that is a little bit of higher concentration there right in north of the coastline, north of Prudhoe Bay to just east of Barrow, and that is probably impeding some ship traffic there. So keep watch for that. North of Kaktovik, many areas of sea-free ice, and you can see the greater concentrations well to the north of that. But this rotting ice right here is still causing some issues there. If you'd like to keep watch on that yourself, you can do that very easily by going to weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php or go to arh. Let's see if I can get that right, www.arh.noaa.gov. And on the left-hand side of your screen, just look for Ice Desk, and you'll see the tools you need to make an image like this, or look for the ice outlook that'll take you well ahead of today's analysis and into the next week or so, maybe even the next month. Here's a look at the forecast now for southeastern Alaska and the marine weather for central parts of the inner waterways, looking at more of a southeasterly wind, 20 knots, and about 4 feet seas they're expected there for Friday. The farther north you go into the Lynn Canal, the windier it's going to be tomorrow. A southerly flow could be as strong as 25 knots with seas around 5 feet. To the south around the Clarence Strait, more of a northwesterly flow, light at 10 knots with a 3-foot sea. And coastal waters generally 15 knots from the south with 8 to 9-foot seas for most areas, 10 feet there. Probably as you get up toward Yakutat. By Saturday, the south and southeasterly winds are kicking in again. Low pressure is moving back into the western Gulf, and that's going to draw a lot more air across the northeastern parts of the Gulf coastal waters. Again, the strongest winds in the northern Lynn Canal, around 20 knots, with Frederick Sound and Stevens Passage looking at more of a south-southwesterly flow. At 10 knots, more of a northwesterly flow continues there in the Clarence Strait with a 2-foot sea on Saturday. Across south central on Friday, a light easterly wind inside Prince William Sound, a little bit more of a southeasterly flow at 15 knots for the north and western Gulf Coast, 20 knots east of Kodiak, and then southerly flow inside of Shelikof Strait. Southeasterlies crossing the Barrens at 15 knots with 3-foot seas in the west, 7-foot seas in the east, and inside Cook Inlet. Wind should be light, even variable across the northern areas there. Northerly flow kicks in again on Saturday. Still light as we start the weekend there with an easterly flow west of the Barrens. East and southeasterly flow in the western Gulf. A stronger southerly flow east of Kodiak Island at 20 knots. And winds could go light and variable inside of Prince William Sound with a 2-foot sea. Southeasterlies outside of Montague Island and Hitching Brook entrance with a 7-foot sea on Saturday. Across the Alaska Peninsula, look for a south and easterly flow, 10 to 20 knots inside of Bristol Bay, coming up to 25 knots across the northern parts of the Alaska Peninsula there. Around 3 to 6 foot seas are expected north of Cold Bay. Southeasterlies 25 to 30 knots on the Pacific side with 5 to 9 foot seas there south of King Cove and Sand Point. As you get into Saturday, a southeasterly flow inside of Bristol Bay is expected. 5 foot seas there. Northwesterlies a little bit further south down the coastline. A south and southwesterly flow on the Pacific side, all at 25 knots with 13 foot seas by Saturday afternoon. For Friday, across the chain, expect northeasterlies from Nikolsky to Unalaska. You can see low pressures working right here, drawing that air around in a counterclockwise fashion. 25 to 30 knots with 9 to 12 foot seas, with strongest winds and the higher seas there, right there along Adak and Atka as we head into Friday morning. Lighter northerly flow crossing Attu and Kiska at 15 to 20 knots. For Saturday, look for a southwesterly shift again in the far western chain. Northwesterlies for just about everywhere else. 15 to 20, even 25 knots north of Unalaska with 6 to 7 foot seas and 6 to 9 foot seas on the Pacific side to start the weekend. Across the west coast, winds should be pretty light across St. Lawrence Island, St. Matthew, and the Pribilofs around 10 to 15 knots with 2 to 3 foot seas. Southeasterlies coming into the Kuskokwim Delta at 20 knots with a 4 foot sea and a northeasterly flow at 20 knots for the Pribilofs. As we get into Saturday, that's a little bit more of a northerly flow with a 6 foot sea. Northeasterlies pick up across the Kuskokwim Delta at 25 knots and winds still from the north and northwest around 15 knots with a 3 foot sea in the northern bearing. Across the Arctic coast, a stronger easterly flow for just about every area, with seas ranging from 8 feet in the Beaufort to 6 and 7 feet around the Chukchi Seacoast. One exception, just outside of Kotzebue Sound with an east flow at 10 knots with a 3 foot sea. That's up to 15 knots by Saturday. And we keep our brisk winds there east of Barrow, a 30 to 35 knot flow with 7 to 9 foot seas expected there. Again, watch out for that ice just off the shore. As we recap tonight's weather, a front is dying in the eastern Gulf, but it's still capable of bringing out copious amounts of rain, as we saw today in Yakutat with 2.5 inches falling there. South Central may still see passing showers and some light rainfall, the heaviest of which, though, will be across the eastern part of Prince William Sound. A new storm taking the rains and the rain and wind through the central chain and moving that slowly eastward into the western Gulf. And we'll see that crank up as we head into Saturday. Thanks for watching.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.